Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Ilaria Simeone, and I am a first year medical student at Tulane. I apologize that I can't be there in person today since I have some orientation activities going on today, but I am happy to be with you, be able to share with you on this recording. So to introduce myself further, I grew up here in New Orleans. I have a bachelor's degree in comparative literature and medical humanities from Columbia, and I received my master's in medical genetics and genomics from the Hayward Center in 2023. So, moving to the topic of my talk today, I will be speaking about the intersections between genetics and narrative medicine. Narrative medicine and really the intersection of medicine and the humanities is something I'm very passionate about. And I wrote about this in my thesis paper for the master's program. So, I really look forward to being able to share it with you today. So I want to start by talking about the diagnostic odyssey. So back in 2022, when I was starting to think about what I would write about for my thesis paper, this term was really my starting point. I remember hearing it for the first time in class, and immediately I was intrigued and I went and started reading about it and doing some research. So this term has those Homeric undertones. It's drawing a parallel to the journey of the Greek epic hero Odysseus. And ultimately, I think it's a really interesting term because it highlights the complexities that patients and their families are facing as they embark on this protracted, unpredictable, and often very lengthy journey in seeking a diagnosis for a rare and or complex genetic condition. So looking at this figure, patients may face a very long road from when symptoms start. They may have that first visit. They may do some of their own research, look at patient forums online. They may then go see a specialist. At that point, there may be a suspected diagnosis, or there may be no diagnosis yet. If they have some symptoms that can be treated, they might be able to start getting some treatment. From there, they might start seeing specialists, and then that turns into a loop of just seeing countless specialists, and um, still no one might have any answers. Then at some point, these patients may be referred to genetics, undergo some genetic testing. And then at that point, once those results come back, they may either reach a diagnosis or just continue in that cycle, continuing to look for a diagnosis. So patients with rare and undiagnosed genetic diseases often remain undiagnosed for many years. They may be misdiagnosed, or they may even die without an accurate diagnosis. So this is a really hard process for patients to go through, and they may face all sorts of impacts, from psychosocial impacts to financial to emotional. So learning about the diagnostic odyssey, I decided I wanted to focus in on this population of patients who face rare and undiagnosed genetic diseases. Um, and so that led me to discover the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. And I want to go through some data from a few studies which looked at patients being evaluated through the UDN. So the UDN, it's an initiative of 12 clinical sites around the country, and their goal is essentially to solve medical mysteries. So each site has multidisciplinary teams who evaluate patients who up until that point are undiagnosed. So patients have to apply to participate, and in about a third of cases, they are able to come up with a diagnosis. So there was one study done in 2018. They looked at 50 parents of undiagnosed children being evaluated through the UDN, and they found that this group of parents exhibited high rates of anxiety and depression. And then there were two other studies done. They looked at adult patients evaluated by the UDN, and they were found to display suffering, frustration, uncertainty, and decreased levels of empowerment. So, taking all of this into consideration, these data suggest that there is an unmet need for psychological support among this patient population and among family members as well. So, considering the many burdens that these patients and their families face, today I want to spend some time talking about how we can work to better understand and address the needs of these patients. So with that, I want to start to tie in narrative medicine and how really it can be an important tool and framework when we start to think about how we can better serve this patient population. So narrative medicine is an intellectual and clinical discipline. It originated at Columbia in the early 2000s by Rita Sharon, who is a literary scholar and internist. And she defines narrative medicine as medicine practiced with the narrative competence to recognize, absorb, interpret, and be moved by the stories of illness. So, in the simplest of terms, narrative medicine is a medicine practiced by someone who knows what to do with stories. It's fundamentally about honoring the voices of patients. So, how do we accomplish this? So, a big part of narrative medicine is the act of close reading and teaching this skill to physicians in order to enhance their ability to hear and absorb the stories of patients. So, that means when you're close reading a text, it means paying close attention, reading it carefully to really interpret and understand its nuances and meanings. And then, of course, narrative medicine is also about inviting patients to tell their own stories to their physicians, to other patients, and to society at large. So tying this into genetics, and like rare genetic diseases, given the unique combination of challenges that are associated with rare genetic diseases and the diagnostic odyssey, so the psychosocial impacts, the general lack of effective treatments, the length of time to diagnosis, my argument is that narrative medicine can really help us to better interpret and understand the experiences of these patients. And then for patients, telling their stories, writing their stories may be beneficial in helping them to better understand their own illness experience. So that brings me to a set of quotes from one of my favorite authors, Anatole Broyard, who wrote this book, Intoxicated by My Illness and Other Writings on Life and Death. Anatole Broyard was a literary critic who worked for the New York Times, and he had prostate cancer and wrote this book while he was undergoing treatment. So he says, stories are antibodies against illness and pain. So I think this quote, it really speaks to the idea that stories have this capacity to transport us to different worlds, to help us to overcome challenges that we face at the present, to evoke and process our emotions, and ultimately to connect with others through the sharing of our human experiences. He also says language, speech, stories, or narratives are the most effective ways to keep our humanity alive. To remain silent is literally to close down the shop of one's humanity. So we talked about the diagnostic odyssey, all of the challenges that it can entail. And I really think it can cause patients to feel like they've lost their voice, like they've become dehumanized. So stories and narratives may be a way to kind of start to restore some of those human elements that are lost in this process. So in the spirit of these quotes, today I will be talking about narratives of rare genetic diseases, what these stories can teach us about this patient population, and how engaging with these stories can really improve the care they receive and the ways in which they are able to cope with their illness. So moving forward to the patient narratives, today I will be doing some close reading of these two illness memoirs. They were both published in the last 6 years, and both authors explore what it means to face a genetic disease of immense rarity when there's a lack of an illness community to draw support from, and when there are familial implications as well. So I chose specifically to focus on this population of patients who are facing rare and undiagnosed genetic diseases because I wanted to think about what happens when a genetic disease doesn't fit in any existing paradigms. What happens when you don't even have a language to talk about the disease you have, when the disease you have doesn't even have a name, and then how these patients and their caregivers can look to narrative and storytelling as a source of support. So the family gene here on the left was written by Jocelyn Linder, who has this dual role. She's both patient and narrator, and she tells a story of her family's experience with a nameless disease that's caused by a genetic variant that many of them share. And then This Boy We Made here on the right was written by Taylor Harris, who is a Black mother, and she talks about her young son's experience in the diagnostic odyssey. So, as I talk about these two memoirs today, ultimately my goal is to call attention to the unique voices of these patients and their families who may feel overlooked, they may feel isolated, they may feel burdened by the really complex medical histories they have and by the elusiveness of their genetics. So, starting with the family gene, this is a picture of the Linder family. This is from 1978, and Jocelyn Linder, the author, is here in the center with a green shirt. And so, to tell you a little bit about this memoir, it tells the story of her family, the Linders, who are considered a founder population for a genetic mutation that has never been previously described before in medical history, and that doctors believe exists only in this family. So her story begins with that of her father, Bill Linder, pictured here. And at age 49, he passed away with no answers for kind of an unusual set of symptoms. So he had a heart murmur, lymphedema, ascites, and then later his autopsy revealed that all of his organs were basically fused together by liters and liters of a thick, like congealed fatty lymph fluid. So, with several of her family members also displaying symptoms like her dad's, this illness was so unique, it was so unusual that it got the attention of a team of researchers at Harvard who still today are leading an ongoing study on this disease, which it still today remains unnamed. And so the mutation that several members of this family share can be traced back to Linder's great great grandmother. She's patient zero. And this is actually, it's a very rare occurrence, since usually genetic variants that cause illnesses, like for example, what we see with cystic fibrosis, usually those variants are dozens or hundreds of generations old. So for many years, this family had no answers. And then over time, the research team at Harvard were able to pinpoint the mutation, and they discovered that it's an X-linked mutation. So I want to share a quote from Jocelyn Linder. This is shortly after finding out that her mutation is on the X chromosome. I think this quote I really like this quote. I find it interesting because she invokes anthropomorphic language. So she says, the X chromosome is also named chromosome 23, but that's its boring name. It's like the Marilyn Monroe of chromosomes, Norma Jean, to those who didn't know what she could become with a little red lipstick and a lot of peroxide. X chromosome Marilyn Monroe, because she is so popular, is actually incredibly prolific, genetically speaking. So her words here, when I first read this quote, I was immediately reminded of something that Anatole Broyard said in his book that I was talking about earlier. And so I want to read his words. He said, every sick person should evolve a style or develop a voice for his or her illness. In my own case, I make fun of my illness. I disparage it. Adopting a style for your illness is another way of meeting it on your own grounds, of making it a mere character in your narrative. So here, I feel like Linder is essentially doing that. She's kind of really contextualizing the X chromosome in this like imaginative, like she's giving it this like flamboyant and like glamorous personality almost. And to me, this is like an attempt to better comprehend, better perceive the chromosome and the mutation themselves, considering that her family's disease is nameless. So to me, this is just one way in which she's starting to craft her own language of illness through this active narrative. So she's starting to grapple with the sphere of the unknown that her and her family find themselves in. So along this thread of the unknown, I want to transition now to the other memoir that I looked at, This Boy We Made. So this is the Harris family pictured here. So that's Taylor Harris, the author, and she's holding her son, Christopher, nicknamed Tophs. So Taylor Harris writes about the diagnostic odyssey of her son, Tophs, who at age 2 presented with kind of an assortment of non-specific symptoms. So he had an inguinal hernia, some episodes of hypoglycemia, carnitine deficiency, failure to thrive, mildly elevated AST level, and then global developmental delay. So I want to begin by talking about the concept of liminality, which is defined as a state of being in between, like a period of limbo. So when Taylor Harris, like when she thinks about potentially finding a diagnosis for her son, she has some like paradoxical emotions associated with this. And I think this quote here is really beautifully written on this topic. So she says, I'd assumed that once we found a name, a label, a house for his symptoms, we'd endure a measure of loss. It's quite possible that living in the liminal space between symptoms and answers has offered me too much loneliness yet, but also space to breathe, distance from the settled grief of knowing. So think here what Harris is showing is that while receiving answers, that may allow patients to better understand the path they have ahead, to start accessing support resources, as well as starting to maybe try to find some sense of community. It may also lead parents to mourn the version of their child's life that they expected. So, along this thread of belonging and wanting to feel that sense of community, I want to spend some time talking about incomprehensibility and inexpressibility, which come up in both of the memoirs that I'm discussing today. So, starting with Jocelyn Linder, at one point she says, we didn't have answers. We lacked a language or guidebook and instead grew accustomed to the frustration and humiliation of the undiagnosed. So I think this really captures the reality that when it comes to a rare and undiagnosed genetic disease that doesn't even have a name, patients struggle with not even having a language to talk about their illness. And so in sharing their story, they can start to create their own language and find the words to confront their reality. And then Harris, along similar lines, also touches on the incomprehensibility of her son's condition when she says, I'm not sure I would know the other side now if it slapped me in the face. How do you recognize the thing you're looking for when it has no name, no shape? So within this feeling of incomprehensibility and limbo and overwhelm, Taylor Harris also in her memoir spends quite a bit of time talking about race and the added challenges that her son and her family faced. And so I think her words really point to the fundamental importance of being aware of how race, how social determinants of health, how disparities are other factors that shape the diagnostic odyssey. So this is a figure that I pulled from a great paper that's called The Influence of Social Determinants of Health on the Genetic Diagnostic Odyssey, Who Remains Undiagnosed, Why, and to What Effect. And so I like this figure because it characterizes, it's kind of reminiscent of what I showed earlier, all the steps of the diagnostic odyssey. So here it really characterizes the barriers that exist at every step of the path to a genetic diagnosis. And I think this really encapsulates the fact that underserved populations are more likely to be missed at each step of the way, which then results in fewer diagnoses being identified. So looking at this figure, starting from the beginning, underrepresented minorities may be less likely to be referred to a clinical geneticist. And then individuals with decreased access to care may be less likely to go in for multiple visits if a blood draw is required or parental testing is needed. And then finally, I think this is a really important one. Once genetic testing is complete, underrepresented minorities may be more likely to get back non-diagnostic genetic testing results. So they have higher rates of variants of uncertain significance due to the lack of diversity in the reference data sets that are used to interpret results. So I think for genetics professionals, it's really important to be aware of all these challenges. And in the future, I look forward to helping to make contributions to this area and really working to address some of these barriers. So with that, I have some concluding thoughts, tying everything together. Today I talked about narratives by writers grappling with rare and undiagnosed genetic diseases, and these narratives reveal some ubiquitous themes. So these writers use figurative language like metaphor and anthropomorphism to cope with and make sense of their lived reality. We see this concept of liminality, feeling stuck in limbo, which on one hand, in the diagnostic odyssey, gives you the sense of space and distance from like a sad reality that you might be approaching, while on the other hand, it can feel very isolating and lacking in that sense of community. And then we also talked about incomprehensibility and inexpressibility and that lack of a language of illness. And then also there's this idea of medicalization of family and kinship. So this idea that if you have family members who might feel guilt that they've passed on a certain mutation, thinking about it in more medicalized terms, that it's something, it can happen spontaneously by chance, that might be a way to kind of take away from that guilt that family members might feel. So ultimately, for this population of patients and their families, I believe that producing written narratives may be a tool to start to generate their own language of illness. And so this in turn can allow these patients to have a greater sense of agency and control in a situation that feels out of their control and overwhelming. It may serve as a means to make sense of and cope with the lived reality that they face. It might help them foster a sense of solidarity and social connection and allow them to feel ultimately as though they are being heard. So that concludes what I wanted to share for my thesis work. I was really lucky to be able to present this work at the 2023 American Society of Human Genetics meeting. I submitted an abstract and had a poster, and my mentor, Chris, really encouraged me to submit this work and to attend, and it was truly an incredible experience. I was able to network with and meet other students, genetics professionals, genetic counselors, professors, researchers, and all of the sessions and the talks that I went to were so informative, so rich. And so I left this meeting really having learned a lot, and with an excitement to be in this field one day and to continue attending this meeting. And this is a picture of me with my poster. And then I also wanted to share a piece of writing that I published this spring, in which I reflected on the lessons I learned in my 3 gap years between undergrad and med school. And in this piece, I mentioned my experience in the master's program and really how enriching and beneficial it was for me. And then finally, this is a little collage that I put together to represent the truly incredible year that I had as part of Hayward Genetics. So this was my class, great friends. I really miss this class. It was just a wonderful year with them. And I also included the zebra, which is like the mascot of like rare diseases. It comes from the quote, "When you hear hoofbeats, it could be a zebra." And then getting to attend the ASHG meeting, learning about the work of the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, the All of Us research program, which is this historic effort through the NIH to engage historically underrepresented populations in biomedical research. And then finally, this is a picture of me when I was like 4 years old in a Tulane lab, looking into the microscope. And now as I'm starting med school, I look back on this and just smile thinking about just how excited I am to be involved in research in the future. So just speaking a little bit on my experience in the program, in the master's program, I feel that it was really instrumental in strengthening my candidacy for medical school. The first time that I applied to med school, I was rejected by every school that I applied to. And I really think having that extra year of grades, having the mentorship with faculty, I think was really key in my success the second time around. I also think that the thesis paper was really, it was a wonderful experience to be able to develop that. And I'm excited now. I'm working on turning that manuscript and preparing it to submit to a medical sociology journal. So I'm excited to publish this work. And I also think just being in the program, it really helped me to sharpen my future goals. So I'm thinking that I would like to specialize in genetics in the future, and that I'd like to do adult genetics. So right now, my Right now I'm thinking that I'd like to do internal medicine and then do like a medical genetics fellowship after that and work in a setting like the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. And then also tying back in narrative medicine, I am excited to be starting a narrative medicine interest group here at Tulane Med School. And I have one more slide. I want to say thank you for having me today. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all the wonderful faculty in this program, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Weisbecker, Dr. Upadia, Dr. Liu, Dr. Lee, Chris, who was my mentor for this thesis project. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for everything and all the support and for giving me a wonderful experience in this program. And I put my contact info here if anyone has any questions or would like to reach out. Thank you so much.